Welcome to Chapter 4 in our Beyond Feelings book, which is our critical thinking book. So in this chapter, we're going to attempt to answer the question, what does it mean to know? And this is one of those chapters that can seem really commonsensical. So what we want to do is try to stay focused and really think about these seemingly simplistic concepts and the real world effect that they have on your life. And just because they're easy to understand or seem like common sense doesn't mean that you or I am impervious to them. We'll also try to answer the question, what does it mean to know, from a philosophical standpoint to get a little deeper into that question and the different layers of knowledge and what it is and the qualifiers of it. So let's go ahead and dive on in. Have you ever been so sure of something only to find out you were wrong? Like taking an exam and then find out that you got an answer wrong that you felt so confident was right, that you felt like you knew it. And then after leaving the class, you walk out to your car and you check the textbook, and to your surprise, you really were wrong. So we've all felt like we know something when we don't. And sometimes we do know something when we feel like we don't. So we're going to kind of investigate that scenario and figure out what it actually means to know. So to kind of create that feeling of feeling like you know something only to find out that maybe you were wrong or maybe you didn't know it as well as you thought you knew it, we're going to do an activity and maybe it'll work for you, maybe it won't. I'm hoping for the best here. But I'm going to show you a video and then I'm going to ask you certain questions like, what color hair did the dead man in the video have? And so don't write anything down as you watch the video. Just watch it, and then I'll ask you some questions about it afterwards.
Clearly, somebody in this room murdered Lord Smythe, who, at precisely 3:34 this afternoon, was brutally bludgeoned to death with a blunt instrument. I want each of you to tell me your whereabouts at precisely the time that this dastardly deed took place.
I was polishing the brass in the master bedroom.
I was buttering his lordship's scones below stairs, sir.
Why, I was planting my petunias in the potting shed.
Constable, arrest Lady Smythe.
But how did you know?
Madam, as any horticulturist will tell you, one does not plant petunias until May is out. Take her away.
Sorry, madam.
It's just a matter of observation. The real question is, how observant were you?
Okay, for our first lecture activity for today, so we can label that Chapter 4, Lecture Activity Number 1, I would like for you to answer the following questions and write how confident you are in your response on a scale of 1 to 10. So 10 is, I'm 100% correct, I absolutely know this, and 1 is, I'm not sure at all, I'm just taking a guess. So not only write your answer, but also go ahead and write your confidence level next to your answer on a scale of 1 to 10. So you might want to go ahead and pause the video here so you can take a moment to do that with the questions up on the screen. Okay, so let's see if you were correct.
Action. Clearly, somebody in this room murdered Lord Smythe, who, at precisely 3:34 this afternoon, was brutally bludgeoned to death with a blunt instrument. I want each of you to tell me your whereabouts at precisely the time that this dastardly deed took place.
I was polishing the brass in the master bedroom.
I was buttering his lordship's scones below stairs, sir.
Why, I was planting my petunias in the potting shed.
Constable, arrest Lady Smythe.
Okay, so what I'm hoping you experienced in that activity was a sense of confidence in your knowledge, a real knowing of something, at least one question, or a high number of confidence, and a 7, an 8, a 9, or a 10. And then I'm hoping you got it wrong so that you can experience kind of that feeling that we're talking about today, which we've all had. I mean, I have it all the time where I think I know something and then I find out, wow, that wasn't correct. That's shocking. So I'm trying to create that feeling so that we can go ahead and discuss with when we think we know, we don't always know, then what exactly does it mean to know? What are the requirements of knowing? What are the criteria? So part of knowing is having the right answer, but knowing involves more than just having the right answer. It also involves the realization that you have the right answer. So not kind of questioning whether or not your answer is correct, but feeling very confident that your answer is correct. It also requires understanding details, complex processes, principles, steps. So if you really understand something, then you can kind of discuss the ins and outs of that something. You can explain it in detail, or you can think about the details and the complexities of it. If it's a bit of knowledge that has to do with putting something together, you can think about the steps that go into putting it together, whether it's a recipe or a bicycle, right? And then the last requirement is that you must have the ability to express what you know and how you know it. Sometimes we don't know how we know something, we just know it. But this is weak and it limits your comprehension. The best way to learn something is to teach it. And if we can teach it, then we can really know it. So we need to be able to express it. Have you ever had a conversation with someone or been in a conversation and you've been the person that's like, I know this, but I just can't explain it, but I really know it? The book is arguing that you don't really know it. Unless you have a complete understanding and are able to express it clearly, then your knowledge maybe isn't as robust as you think. Maybe it's actually a little bit limited. We're going to go ahead and watch a philosophy video on knowledge and what it means to know, and kind of get that perspective on it so that we can get a more in-depth look at the requirements of knowledge and knowing.
Crash Course Philosophy is brought to you by Squarespace. Squarespace, share your passion with the world.
You probably think you know a lot of things, but do you know what it means to know something? We've spent quite a bit of time discussing beliefs and knowledge, but we haven't really been specific about what we mean when we talk about those things. Thankfully, philosophers love a good definition. They have very specific and lucid ideas in mind when they use terms like know, or believe, or proposition, or justification. And about 10 minutes from now, you too will know what you're really saying when you use those words. But just because these terms have been defined doesn't mean that philosophers aren't still arguing over them. Because, that's how philosophers do. Their definitions might seem kind of obvious at first, but the more you think about them, the more nuanced they turn out to be. Like, is having knowledge of something the same thing as being correct? Or if you believe something to be true and it is true, does it matter if your belief in it is justified? And can you be right about something without really trying? Answer to these weird questions and more await you, as well as cats. So you've heard this already. Philosophers love a good argument. But you've figured out by now that philosophers argue in a different way than like kindergarten kids or internet trolls or other people who confuse arguing with sniping back and forth or just thinking up witty comebacks. Nope. Philosophers have all kinds of rhetorical devices at their disposal that they can use to advance an idea or call into question the ideas of their interlocutors. So in order to hold your own in a philosophical debate, you're gonna have to know the difference between two things that sound like exactly the same thing: an assertion and a proposition. And you'll need to be able to tell when someone actually knows what they're talking about, or if they just believe what they're saying might be true. For example, the sentence I'm saying right now is an assertion. An assertion is a linguistic act, either spoken or written, that has a truth value. And despite what it might sound like, truth value isn't a measure of how right something is. It's just the state of being either true or false or indeterminate. All declarative sentences have truth values. Declarations that assert something about the past or present are either true or false. And assertions about the future are indeterminate, at least when they're expressed, because no one knows if they're right or not yet. For example, I'm gonna assert that this cat will pee on my desk before the end of the show. That assertion has a truth value, but it's indeterminate because the show's not over yet. We're just gonna have to wait and see. Now all this contrasts with other kinds of linguistic acts like questions, which don't assert anything. This is a cat is an assertion, as opposed to is that a cat, which is a linguistic act, but not an assertion. But the substance of what you assert has a name too. The content of your assertion is your proposition. It's the underlying meaning of what you're saying. So even though an assertion itself can change depending on, say, what language it's spoken in, its meaning doesn't change just because its outer packaging does. Like, this is a cat and este es un gato both assert the same proposition. And a proposition is true if it asserts a claim that corresponds to reality. The proposition, when I assert this is a cat, is true if the object of the this is in fact a cat, and false if it is anything other than a cat, like this is a cat. It's worth pointing out that attitude counts too when you're asserting something. A speaker's mental state toward the proposition they're making is their propositional attitude. If I say, like, this is a cat, but I actually believe it to be a rat and I'm trying to fool you, then philosophers would say that I have a propositional attitude of disbelief. Whereas if I think I'm speaking truthfully, I have a propositional attitude of belief. And of course, you're not going to get very far as a philosopher unless you understand the classic definition of belief itself. Based on the lingo you've learned so far today, belief is just when you take a propositional attitude of truth. I believe that this is a cat if I think it's true. That is, if my attitude is that the assertion corresponds to reality. And even if I'm wrong, even if there were an aardvark on my desk, or if there weren't a cat on my desk at all, which there isn't anymore, if I really thought there was a cat on my desk, that would just be my belief. My propositional attitude, in other words, is what determines if I have a belief. What all this means is that I, like everyone else, can have false beliefs. Simply thinking something doesn't make it correspond to reality, which is what's needed for truth. But of course, the fun of arguing is showing off what you know to other people, or at least producing really clever evidence to support your case. So this raises the question of what it means to actually know something in the philosophical sense. The traditional definition of knowledge is that it's a justified, true belief. Note that there are three separate components here. So I have knowledge that this is a cat if I first believe that it's a cat, and also it must in fact be a cat. That is, my belief corresponds to reality and is therefore true. And finally, I can be said to have knowledge about the cat if my belief is justified, meaning I have some sort of legitimate evidence to support my belief. Now, we've already defined truth and belief. Justification is simply evidence or other support for your belief. If you remember back to episode 2, you will recall that premises offer justification for conclusions, and justification can come in a variety of forms. Most often, it comes about through testimony, just taking someone's word for it. Not all testimony is strong or trustworthy, of course, but if it comes from someone who is an expert on the topic in question, you might consider the testimony to be reliable. And the fact is, most of what you know about the world, you learned through testimony. You took your teacher's word for it when they were teaching you stuff, and the same goes for every book you've ever read and every news report you've ever seen. They're all just forms of testimony, which you accepted as justification for your knowledge and your beliefs. But justification can come in other forms too. Another common type is first-person observation, information you acquire through your senses. If I believe that a cat is a cat because I already have robust and well-informed beliefs about cats, then having had extensive experience with them in the past, I'm identifying the cat as a cat through my direct contact with it. It looks, feels, acts like a cat, ergo cat. But philosophy wouldn't be any fun if the key to knowledge were that easy, right? Until American philosopher Edmund Gettier came along in the 1960s, philosophers were in pretty widespread agreement about the definition of knowledge, that it's justified true belief. Because you can believe any old thing, but in order to know something, it just makes sense that you also have to have evidence for your belief, and it must be true. In other words, you can have a false belief, but you can't have false knowledge. And if something you thought you knew turns out not to be true, then the fact is you never actually knew it, you just believed it. And likewise, you might happen to hold a true belief, but if you don't have any justification for it, if you just accidentally happened to be right, which happens sometimes, that doesn't count as knowledge either. Enter Edmund Gettier. Gettier wrote a short but fabulously influential paper that turned the standard understanding of knowledge upside down. He did this by proposing what have come to be known as Gettier cases, situations in which one can have justified true belief, but not knowledge. Which brings us to this week's Flash Philosophy. Let's go to the thought bubble. Here's one of Gettier's original cases. Smith and Jones have both applied for the same job. The president of the company told Smith that Jones will get the job. This counts as evidence. The president of the company would seem to be a reliable source of this information. Meanwhile, Smith counts the coins in Jones's pocket and sees that there are 10 coins in there. Smith then forms a belief based on his first-person observational evidence of the coins as well as the testimony of the company president. He comes to the belief that the person who gets the job has 10 coins in his pocket. But it turns turns out the testimony of the president was false, and it's Smith, not Jones, who gets the job. And it just so happens, unbeknownst to Smith, that he also has 10 coins in his pocket. So Smith has a belief that the person who gets the job has 10 coins in his pocket, and that is justified because he counted Jones's coins and the president told him Jones was getting the job. And his belief also turned out to be true. The person who got the job did have 10 coins in his pocket. However, neither pieces of justification actually pointed Smith to the right answer. The president's testimony was wrong, and the 10 coins that he saw were in Jones's pocket, not his own. So it seems Smith simply lucked into being right. Gettier argued that we now have a case of justified true belief that is not knowledge. As he pointed out, you don't know something if you simply stumbled into the right answer. Thanks, Thought Bubble. The philosophical world was turned upside down by this idea, and philosophers, loving a good counterexample, began generating their own Gettier cases. American philosopher Roderick Chisholm proposed this one. Looking across a field, you see an object that looks like a sheep, and you form the belief that there is a sheep in the field. It turns out that the object you see is actually a dog. Yet there is also a sheep obscured from your vision by a hill. So you have a justified true belief, but the justification for your belief, the object that you saw, is not a sheep. You just lucked into being right. Once you understand how it works, it's pretty easy to generate Gettier cases of your own. And many philosophers today think Gettier successfully destroyed the justified true belief definition of knowledge. But even though the 1960s might seem long ago to you, remember, philosophers are in the business of having millennia-long debates about stuff. So it shouldn't surprise you that the philosophical debate about this is still raging. But if knowledge is not justified true belief, then what is it? Next time, we will look at one possible answer. In the meantime, you learned about some of the key concepts we use when discussing belief and knowledge. You learned what defines an assertion and a proposition, and that belief is a kind of propositional attitude. We also talked about forms of justification and the traditional definition of knowledge, which Edmund Gettier totally messed with using his Gettier cases. And the cat did not pee on my desk, because the cat was unable to spend any time at all on my desk, so it turns out the assertion that I made was false. But it is a true assertion that this episode was brought to you by Squarespace. Squarespace helps to create websites, blogs, or online stores for you and your ideas. Websites look professionally designed regardless of skill level, no coding required. Try Squarespace at squarespace.com/crash course for a special offer. Crash Course Philosophy is produced in association with PBS Digital Studios. You can head over to their channel to check out amazing shows like Game Show, The Chatterbox, and Physics Girl. This episode of Crash Course was filmed in the Dr. Cheryl C. Kinney Crash Course studio with the help of these awesome people, and our equally fantastic graphics team is Thought Cafe.
Okay, so let's go ahead and test our knowledge, and then we will look at the answers to these questions and get a sense of how it feels when maybe our knowledge is challenged, or if we were wrong when we thought we knew something, and how our ego kind of responds to that. So for our second lecture activity, I'd like you to number your document 1 through 5. Go ahead and read the questions on the slide and then answer true or false. So you can go ahead and pause the video so that you can have the questions up as you answer them, and then when you come back, we'll discuss the answers. Alright, so the more of these that you feel like you know, and the surer you are of your knowledge, the less likely you are to accept the truth if the truth challenges what you thought you know, because of our ego. The feelings associated with knowing are very powerful. So I'm going to tell you the answers to the questions 1 through 5 now. And as I give you those answers, I want you to really feel your ego kind of swell up. If you got an answer wrong, I want you to feel the doubt in what I'm telling you. But keep in mind that these are facts, and you can actually read further explanation of the answers on page 42 and 43 in your Beyond Feelings textbook. And even as you read the further explanations, feel your ego kind of welling up and criticizing the research or doubting the research or whatever. So the answers to questions 1 through 5 are all false. So go ahead and feel the doubt, feel your ego swell up. It's hard to separate our ego from our knowledge or our belief of our knowledge. And that's just part of becoming a good critical thinker, is learning to shed your ego and not hold so tightly to what you think you know. and instead be able to kind of accept challenges with an open mind. So to speak to that idea, we have Epictetus, who was a Greek philosopher, and has this quote: "Get rid of self-conceit, for it is impossible for anyone to begin to learn what he thinks he already knows." So this question is really one of the most effective tools in becoming a good critical thinker. Keeping in mind, is it possible that what I and other people think we know isn't really so? So being open to having your knowledge challenged is key. What we're going to talk about now is how we come to know. We're going to take a look at that process. There's two types of learning. There's active learning and passive learning. And active learning is achieved by direct experience, by testing, improving an idea, or by reasoning. So just to give us a definition that we can work with for reasoning, reasoning is defined as analyzing a problem, considering all facts and possible interpretations, and then drawing the logical conclusion. Passive learning is being told something by someone we know or something we hear on the media, Facebook, TV, news, classroom. And the thing about passive learning is that it doesn't involve any critical thinking. Someone says something and we kind of just go, okay, and that goes into our brains and becomes part of what we think is our bank of knowledge. So it can cause us to accept things as fact that are really just hearsay and rumors. And what happens in passive learning is the same thing that happens in the game of telephone, which happens in real life all the time. We unintentionally change the message of a story by putting things in our own words as we process them or express them, changing the tone, switching a word around. We don't always hear everything correctly, so then when we process it, we try to make sense of it. If we miss details, we'll just kind of add them in. And many people add their own touch to a story. They kind of try to spice it up. And that can happen even unconsciously. We don't really even realize that we're doing that all of the time. And sometimes when we make just those little tweaks to a story that we've heard from someone else, that becomes secondhand information that maybe is completely different from the first-hand source. So what I want you to do for the next lecture activity is play the game of telephone, or discuss a time when the game of telephone has kind of impacted your life in a real way. So a time where you got second or third hand information that was incorrect. So for lecture activity 3, you can either start a fresh game of telephone and tell me how it goes. I always play this game in class just to show how quickly the message gets distorted. And usually by person 2, it's a completely different story than the story I told person 1. So let me know how it goes. Or if you don't have anyone you can play the game of telephone with, then I just want you to think about a time when someone gave you information that was maybe second or third hand and you later found out the true story and it was completely different. So knowing isn't always easy. Knowledge isn't always cut and dry. There's a bunch of reasons that knowing is difficult. The first one is that there are some questions that we just can't find the answers to yet. What causes cancer? Are there life on other planets? Maybe one day we'll know the answers to those questions, but maybe right now we don't have the technology or the resources to know. The second reason that knowing is difficult is because everyday situations arise that have never been an issue before. We don't have a reference or a solution in cases like that, so we're kind of just winging it in terms of coming up with our own solution to the problem. For example, as marijuana becomes legal recreationally and medicinally across our country, it is creating a bunch of issues that people just have to figure out how they're going to deal with. So my aunt lives in Colorado where marijuana is recreationally legal, and she tells me that they're kind of constantly always coming up with these new rules as different situations arise. She said that she was recently gardening in her backyard and this just like overwhelming smell of marijuana was coming into her backyard from one of her neighbors. And she just thought to herself, is that okay? Do I mind that? Is there a law against where people can smoke? Or is it okay if the secondhand smoke's coming into my backyard? Is it dangerous for me? So these are the types of questions that are now something that our society has to deal with because we haven't dealt with this before. And then the third reason that knowing is difficult is because as generations pass other generations, information is rejected or forgotten. For example, old wives' tales that might be great advice, but people have just kind of stopped saying them, so that knowledge isn't transferred on. Natural elixirs that work better than maybe prescription medications, but prescription medications are maybe more accessible, and so the natural elixirs are kind of forgotten or no longer discussed. And then the fourth reason that knowing is difficult is because sometimes we accept things as fact and then consider the knowledge like a dead issue when in fact it's really not. For example, when I was in elementary school, we learned that Christopher Columbus discovered America, but now, of course, we know that that is like profoundly wrong. There's a ton of other people here before he got here. But, if I didn't keep kind of paying attention to American history, I might not ever know that now we're not taught Christopher Columbus was the discoverer of this country. Okay, so if what we are saying is that, to be a critical thinker, you need evidence. In order to say you have knowledge, you really have to know the ins and outs of it, the details of it, the processes. You have to be able to explain it very clearly. Then I'm going to ask you this question. Is faith a form of knowledge? So what I'd like for you to do is, for our final lecture activity, I'd like for you to write down lecture activity 4. I'd like for you to write down if what we're saying about knowledge requiring evidence is denouncing the idea of faith, right? Faith, by definition, is believing in something in the absence of evidence. So is it possible to be a critical thinker and also a person of faith? Is faith a credible form of knowledge? So go ahead and write your response to that question for lecture activity 4. Okay, so knowledge and faith are not mutually exclusive. They can both exist. Religious faith suggests belief in something that cannot be proved. But that does not mean that religious belief is not true. It just means that we can't conclusively demonstrate it. So are you somehow abandoning your religious faith by accepting the conditions of knowledge if you are a religious person? Ultimately, that's up to you. There are some prominent evangelistic scholars that suggest abstaining from philosophical investigation is a bad idea. They argue that God wouldn't have given us this critical thinking mind if God didn't want us to use it. So the mind needs to think critically and consider issues, and that's kind of defense of being a person of faith that still upholds the tenets of being a good critical thinker and buying into the idea that knowledge requires evidence. So there are lots of people that believe knowledge and faith can both exist simultaneously. Let's discuss obstacles to knowledge. There's 2 habits that impede knowledge, assuming and guessing. I think we should start by defining those and delineating between the two of them. So assuming is arbitrarily accepting something as true that has not been proven or may be reasonably disputed. Assuming is usually an unconscious act, so we are often unaware of our assumptions and their influence on us. And assumptions stop the creative process that leads to the discovery of knowledge. So your book talks about this idea that when we look at a fish tank, we don't really think that those fish are doing much in there other than just swimming around, that they're not necessarily like living these full lives that have social interactions in the way that we do as humans. But the truth is that fish have communities and roles. Underwater sociologist Lavette Smith says that there are fish equivalents to barbers, firemen. Some fish work at day, some at night. Some live sedentary lifestyles. But we make the assumption that fish are just like these mindless beings floating around in a fish tank doing nothing. But that's really just kind of an idea that we're arbitrarily accepting without even really giving it much thought. And then guessing is offering a judgment on a hunch or taking a chance on an answer without any confidence it's correct. So kind of like offering a guess. And this can be a survival technique to students who didn't study for an exam. It's not always a bad idea if it's a last resort. But it's just totally random guessing. It's not reliable. It denies the importance of evidence. So, for example, this professor had his students do a beer taste test to determine if they could tell the difference between good beer and bad beer. And he removed the labels before they had the beer. And not one student could identify a single brand correctly after they were like so confident that that their beer of choice was better than everyone else's beer of choice. Like, oh, Coors Light's the best beer. But once those labels were removed, they couldn't tell which was which at all. So guessing isn't really reliable either. And whenever you're unsure, don't convince yourself that you are sure. Be honest with yourself about your limitations. Proceed with caution. Speak in probabilities and possibilities. One great way to do that is to use words like I think instead of I know. And this allows you to kind of be honest about your limitations. So don't be afraid to say you don't know. This demonstrates intellectual honesty, restraint, and good sense. And like I always say, nobody likes a know-it-all anyways. So it's okay to be honest about your limitations and say, this could possibly be true. I think it's probably true, but I don't know for sure. So it doesn't mean that you should answer all your questions with maybes, just the questions that you don't have substantial evidence to make a conclusion. We just want to be cautious about tricking ourselves into believing that we know something we don't know just to kind of serve our ego. That is it for Chapter 4 from Beyond Feelings, so we will see you next time. Have a good day.